they're one of the biggest ensembles in Europe and the world doing this kind of music, and to get to work with them pretty regularly on this repertoire is super exciting.
Reed Puleo was a US Fulbright student during the 2022-23 program year. A contemporary musician, Reed spent his grant period studying at the University of Performing Arts Graz and working with the contemporary music ensemble Klangforum Wien to hone his percussion skills. Nearly a year after his grant ended, we met up with Reed to discuss his experience as a percussionist in the US and in Austria, as well as what he has been doing in Austria since his grant ended.
I'd say there's much more clear expectations in the US, actually, for this kind of stuff versus Austria. And you hold meetings like much more regularly in the US. In Austria, I feel like it's more kind of towards a professional model of how things work. Like for a concert, for example, instead of having rehearsal like every week for a couple weeks or a couple times a week, maybe for 3 weeks or 2 weeks, here in Austria, you have maybe only 3 or 4 days right before the concert happens that you just rehearse, and kind of all your time practicing is leading up to that. So it's much less time kind of in between to fix your errors. It's like you got to be ready or you're not ready at all, basically. I'd say as in a freelance kind of sense, there's more opportunities in Austria for lots of things, and also the level is generally higher when you go to a gig like this gig I have right now. It's people sound good and pretty prepared. No kind of bad eggs making the thing go poorly. In the US, I feel like that's more common. Like you show up to a gig and at least one person's kind of got a bad attitude or isn't really prepared, for whatever reason. And it could be a bit of a drag sometimes if that happens. But in Austria, there's definitely more kind of classical music gigs just for freelance stuff, or also more like stable and kind of prominent ensembles. That in the US, you have to kind of build your own project in that way, or it's a much smaller group of people doing these kind of things. But maybe in the US, it's also more varied. There's more kinds of stuff actually happening. Maybe not as big of a scale, but there's more projects, more types of projects, I should say. Like in Austria, I feel like there's not really like a Broadway or musical theater is not a thing. Pretty much, I feel like. And in the US, like in New York or bigger cities, Chicago, LA, these kind of things are much more regular and a part of the freelance life, along with orchestras and classical orchestras or jazz and stuff. But definitely I feel like there's more opportunities in Austria in general, but the level is higher, and compared to the US, just a bit different in terms of the styles that are happening. I think because the university stuff here is more modeled after how it works professionally with shorter time periods, it actually does prepare people better here for that kind of that style and that method of gigging, I guess. In the US, there's more of an adjustment period, I feel like, because there's this weird in between of you get out of school and then you're trying to find stuff to do, but it's much more compact than in school when you have a couple weeks of rehearsals. And then once you start freelancing, it's maybe you have 1 week or a couple days of a show or a project or concert, whatever. So it's a weird sort of disconnect there in the US. So I had my own private practice room, which is kind of crazy, where all my stuff was just living. In some ways, it was good and bad because I could go whenever I wanted. So I could maybe, sleep in a bit and just roll into school and maybe it's already 11 by that point. My day is kind of ruined at even that early, I feel like. because like in the US or wherever you go to school, or if you study percussion, wherever, you're sharing the studio with other people pretty much, unless you're like the only person in the studio, which is very rare. So I was not always fighting with people to get a room, but I always had to schedule it much more rigidly back home. Like, I would like sign out a practice room at 2, go for an hour, like really focused, and then leave and go just do something else. But here it's like, it was mostly, I had a lot of open time where I could just practice whatever I wanted. And that was sort of, it was good and bad, like I just said, because of maybe too relaxed. I could go in late or whatever. But then also if I needed a lot of time to practice something, I had it, which is great. Yeah, this is kind of a long story. So one of the new members of this ensemble that I work with, like that I was studying with in Graz, the newest percussionist, went to my high school. He had my teacher in New Jersey when he was in high school. So I had heard of this guy a lot, and like my old teacher was saying, yeah, Alex is doing all this crazy stuff. You gotta check him out, man. We met eventually, and then he reached out to me and said, there's this cool program in Graz you might want to check out. And then I'd reached out to the people who like more concretely like working in the program, like the other teachers and that kind of stuff. And they seemed interested to have me. I sent them a couple recordings. We had like a couple Zoom calls, and they were looking for a percussionist because there was nobody in the program at that time. Yeah, I mean, just the connection with the ensemble is big. They're one of the biggest ensembles in Europe and the world doing this kind of music, and to get to work with them pretty regularly on this repertoire is super exciting. And it was crazy that I had like this in basically from my old teacher student, and he let me know about it, which I'm very grateful for. I feel like in the US, I was always very technical, and that's a way to say it, technical and like very literal with my music I was doing. A comment I was getting all the time was like, yeah, you're playing super accurately and like, right, everything's, there on the page, but could it be more like, have more energy behind it, or have more kind of feeling behind it, or, whatever. And I feel like that's big, not just in Austria, but in Europe in general. They're more, removed from the score. They play what's on the page, but it's sort of extra musical factors that they focus on a little bit more here. In terms of contemporary music, they're doing a lot of extended techniques that are just normal to them, not as if they're like a special kind of nervous thing. There's lots of nervous energy around this one specific sound. In the US, people feel like that a lot. Like they maybe overemphasize or don't. It's not cohesive enough if you do an extended technique or these kind of special sounds. But they're just part of playing music here, I'd say. That's one large thing that the players, musicians, whoever in the US can learn from. But in like Austria, they could definitely use more, just not focus, but maybe more organization. That's what I've been missing a lot. Could be, you can learn a thing or two from the US about this kind of scheduling and just organization stuff, and letting people know, what they need much, like really far in advance. But yeah, I think that's it for both sides. I did all the normal touristy stuff. I feel like I've also done, museums and seeing all the concerts around Vienna and other places in Austria, like in Graz. There's some cool stuff happening there. But my roommates last year were all Austrian. Like I was the only non-Austrian person that had lived there in the history of the flat, I think. So they were cooking for me a lot, like Austrian food, like dumplings and these like potato pancakes. Yeah, there's lots of Austrian food and these kind of things at my old apartment. But I was in Grafenegg for like 2 weeks this past summer, this kind of like more countryside area. And we had, these like hamburger things, eating outside, and the meats and, all that stuff. So I haven't delved too much into it, I feel like, because most of my friends are not Austrian that I met over the course of the past year. My school is very international. lots of, Balkan people, or even some people from Korea. Some from close by, some from a bit far away. But yeah, at the end of the day, it's all like we're all in Austria and doing these Austrian things and having the Austrian food, Yeah, I'd say it did have an impact because when I go to concerts or whatever, if that's in Vienna or wherever, for this kind of music, generally the audience is larger, but because contemporary music is not so like institutionalized in the US like it is here, it's like very kind of part of the culture. So if you go to a Klangforum concert, or you go to like an orchestra concert, but with lots of contemporary music, like there's this Wie Modern festival that happens, which is great. I feel like it's just part of the culture in Vienna, which has been kind of interesting for this kind of music, because it's so, like I said, institutionalized. Just a bit strange, because for most people in the US, you think of this kind of music as like alternative, I guess. It's outside the norm of classical music. But here it feels like it's very much a part of it, actually. It's like another extension of, Mozart and Mahler and these kind of composers. So I stayed in Graz. I re-enrolled at the school to extend my studies and my visa. But yeah, I was hanging around Austria during the summer. I was in Grafenegg, like I said, and I did another kind of festival in Graz as well, which was pretty cool. But then I decided to stay for a little longer because we had some pretty cool projects happening in Graz, in January, and I had some concerts in Basel also. So it's close by, relatively close by to go there and play and then come back. So yeah, just trying to freelance a bit, continue playing this kind of music as much as I can. But my idea is to probably leave soon, go back to the US. Applying for teaching jobs and hoping to spread what I learned here basically back home and play some more concerts and organize my own projects, like solo projects, or, kind of form a group of some kind and play around. Maybe, I'm not sure where exactly, but, we'll see how that falls. I definitely think you should tie your portfolio or your work samples to your project that you want to do in Austria. The panel wants to see your playing abilities for sure. If you're a good musician, or not just musician, but artist or whatever, they want to know that you have kind of a relationship already with the stuff you want to do in Austria, and that you experience with it and you have a solid foundation. They want to see you're a great musician and you're a great artist, so they give it to you in the first place, not just because you have a great idea. You want to already have the skills and the kind of experience to back it up, basically. And then once you get here, I'd say just try to say yes to as many things as you can, because you never know where it's going to lead. Be very focused on your project and your ideas, what you came here for, but also, open up your blinders a bit and look around, see what else is happening. Trying to get outside your comfort zone, always good.